Thanks everyone. It's lovely to be here with you and to see so many of you in the room. Can you tell me if you can see my slides?
Yes, everything is fine, Charlie. Just you can go in presenter mode, I guess. Or it's in presenter mode now. So sorry.
Yeah, that's happy. That's fine with me. Thank you, and thanks for that kind introduction. Just one slight correction. Jeroen presented me as being a lecturer at University of Kent. In fact, I have left University of Kent partially to concentrate on other ways of having an impact. So while I'm still affiliated with University of Kent as an associate lecturer, I'm not actually teaching there. But yes, today I want to speak to you about how we as scientists and as the global academic community have been responding to our planetary emergency, and how I feel we should be responding, because clearly our response so far has not been sufficient. So a couple of years ago, 11,000 scientists signed this World Scientists Warning of Climate Emergency that was published in the journal Biosciences. Many of you in this room perhaps will have signed this. I signed it. The number of signatories has now grown to almost 15,000. And this paper brings together a whole range of different data sources, and on the basis of this declares that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. Now, this paper only talked about the climate emergency. It doesn't talk about the destruction of the living world, what's called the ecological emergency. It doesn't talk about problems associated with chemical pollution that are affecting fertility and things like this. This is just about climate. But what's interesting was their use of the word emergency. They didn't call it a crisis, but they used this word. They chose this word emergency, and they chose it very, very carefully. The word has lost a bit of power now. We've heard it being used by people who have no intention of taking action. It became the Oxford English Dictionary Word of the Year in 2020. But I think it's a really important word, because it's a word that doesn't just describe the problem, it implies a solution. In an emergency, we take emergency action. So the scientific community and the academic community more broadly has been reacting to this emergency. We've been adapting what we do in order to try and have an impact on this planetary emergency. And the Max Pruitt's Labs is a wonderful example of this. I've been reading a bit about your amazing initiatives just this morning. But in general, I think the academics and the research and higher education sector have reacted in three main ways. Firstly, we have worked on reducing our own institutional footprints, reducing the impacts of our activities as research institutions. And there's a lot being written about this. Jeroen contributed to this very compelling paper about why, as a sector, higher education institutions must show leadership in these societal transitions. And we've started to see promises made by lots and lots of universities worldwide. Over 1,000 universities have made net zero pledges. Unfortunately, many of these pledges are very distant. They give a decarbonization date of 2050, and of course, without interim targets, a target of 2050 is often an excuse for inaction, because administrators know that they won't be in place by 2050. So often they choose inaction and leave it to their successors to address. But at least now we are seeing talk. At least universities are talking about making these transitions. The second major change we see is in our teaching and our engagement. We're seeing huge growth in research about how to integrate climate teaching more broadly into university curricula. Just last month, the University of Barcelona became the first in the world to commit to ensuring that every single student passing through that university would receive some education on the climate emergency. And really, it's just incredible. It is just incredible that in 2022, students are leaving universities without any knowledge of this planetary emergency. A massive, massive failing there. Of course, beyond formal teaching, we are also seeing a growth in engagement and outreach activities and public communication of science by the academic community. This climate lecture series at Max Pruitt's labs, the videos hosted online, is one small example of these increasing engagement activities. And then thirdly, of course, we are seeing shifts not just in our teaching, but the research we do. Many individual academics are shifting the focus of their research away from the things that they might ideally be doing, the things that interest them most, towards topics that are more important for addressing the emergency. So this, on the top here, we see this was an article in the careers column of Nature a few months ago, focusing on 4 researchers who have shifted their research focus towards subjects that they feel are more important in this emergency. On the bottom, this is the website of Faculty for a Future. This is a British initiative which aims to facilitate the academic community, a transition in the way the academic community researchers, not just in the teaching and the engagement we do, but particularly also in the research we do. So they aim to provide resources to help academics that want to shift focus. So we're seeing this response from the academic community. We are now engaging more to address our own institutional footprints. We are now transitioning our teaching to focus more on the emergency, and we are transitioning our research to focus on the emergency. And Max Pruitt's Labs is a great example of all of these. And these things, of course, are super important. It is really fantastic that these initiatives are happening. However, I suggest that even if these types of initiatives were carried out at every university, and even if they were hugely successful in achieving their aims, I still don't think that would be enough given the emergency context. Addressing our own institutional footprints is important, but it's not enough in a planetary emergency, because this is addressing impacts at a local scale. We need to also address impacts at a planetary scale. So the physical scale isn't sufficient. Teaching is not enough, because it will be a generation before the young people we are teaching in our universities are in a position of leadership, and we do not have a generation to wait. We have no time to lose. And then the third element is, I think, the most important one, relying on our research, because I think this has been one of the main reasons why we see a reticence and reluctance of the academic community to engage in climate action, because I think as a community, we feel that our job is to do research, and doing research is enough. If we provide the information, the rest of the world can act on that information. Therefore, we are justified in limiting ourselves to research because this is the most important thing. Well, this is an assumption that I would like to examine today. Is it the case that knowledge alone is sufficient to make the world a better place? Is knowledge all we need? And I would argue that the climate crisis is very clear demonstration that knowledge alone is not sufficient. This chart here shows several things. The color stripes you see are the warming stripes. Each band represents 1 year from 1960 to 2020, and the color represents the global average temperature that year compared to pre-industrial levels. Blue years were colder than average, red years are hotter than average. The slope of this graph shows atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, and we've marked it with certain key dates from from climate science and from climate policy, particularly the dates of the key meetings, key conference of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The UNFCCC was established in 1992 as a result of climate science. Climate scientists had been putting out such alarming information about the observed and future impacts of climate change that the world's governments got together and agreed collectively to bring down and eventually eliminate emissions. But as this graph shows, global climate policy has been a complete failure. So we don't have we don't know what would have happened to the climate in the absence of any negotiations. But nevertheless, this chart is quite a clear indication that our knowledge and the political action that knowledge has inspired have not been sufficient. They have not made a dent on emissions or temperatures. The more the world's governments have met to discuss climate change, the more and more emissions have risen and the hotter and hotter it has got. So we need to examine why this is happening. Why are these meetings not leading to outcomes that are effective? And that's because the decisions made at these meetings are ultimately not decisions that are guided by scientific knowledge. Last year at COP26, the final text of the summit mentioned coal. It was the first time that any fossil fuel has ever been mentioned in a COP text. This year, COP27, coal was mentioned again, but oil and gas weren't. So now governments of the world have been meeting for 27 years, and they have not yet mentioned oil and gas in the COP text. This is despite the fact that we know that burning fossil fuels has been responsible for 82% of our emissions. So how can it be that the scientific knowledge is very, very clear that the biggest issue we have to address is burning fossil fuels? So how come in the global negotiations fossil fuels are not mentioned? Well, this is because of the influence of the fossil fuel industry. At both COP26 and COP27, the largest delegation belonged to the fossil fuel industry, professional lobbyists of the fossil fuel industry. This year at COP27, I think it was the director or the CEO of BP attended the summit officially as an official delegate of Mauritania. He wasn't even counted as a fossil fuel delegate. He was an official country delegate. And this points us towards, the problem with our assumption that as academics, we can change the world through producing the research, because this isn't an information deficit problem. We have the information. The problem is that the information is not being used to make good decisions. And this applies not just at the global policy level, but also at domestic policies. So here are some headlines just from the few months after COP26. Within 3 days of the end of COP26, Joe Biden's administration held the largest sale of oil and gas permits in US history. The UK now is promoting the expansion of oil and gas in the North Sea. You will all have heard how the UK has approved a new coal mine. So despite what the science is telling us, our governments have chosen to go in the opposite direction. They set targets. They say fine words about decarbonization. But of course, 2050 targets and fine words about decarbonization mean nothing. We cannot meet our decarbonization targets without domestic policies that will take us in the right direction. But as we see, country after country is going in the wrong direction. So we need to examine this, I think. Why is producing the science not enough to lead to policy change? And I think it's because our theory of change in science is incredibly naive. I think we have two big theories of change as scientists. All of us, I think we become scientists, one, just because we're curious people and we love research and we love to ask interesting questions about the world, but we also want to make the world a better place. And I think we have two theories of change about how science makes the world a better place. The first is that, if we produce the information and make it available to our leaders will use that information to make wise decisions in the public good. But as we already saw by looking at the climate COP process, that is not the case. I think we also think that we can achieve change through publicizing our research, publicizing our knowledge. We think that if we warn the public about what's happening, we warn them with the science, then the public will force our leaders to take the action that is required. But again, this theory of change is also based on naive assumptions. So our first theory of change, it's false, because our governments don't listen primarily to scientists. They are driven by an economic growth imperative, and they respond primarily to donors and corporate lobbyists. And to a lesser extent, they also respond to public pressure. But the donors and corporate lobbyists wield huge power. They are hugely influential. In 2020, for example, the oil and gas sector spent $136 million in political donations and another $110 million on lobbying, just in the USA. So that's $250 million in one country in just 1 year. And, this is just oil and gas. It says doesn't include money from the coal sector. It doesn't include money from the freight transport sector that transports all the fossil fuels. It doesn't include anything from agribusiness. It doesn't include anything from agrochemicals. It doesn't include lobbying from aviation, from automobiles, from, you know, concrete sector, from the house building sector, construction. All of these different sectors are lobbying our governments. And so I think as scientists, we think that if we give information to our governments, they will take that information on board, but we forget that we are not the only people speaking to our governments. We go to them and, you know, with their left ear, the governments might be listening to the scientists, but with their right ear, they are listening to all these corporate lobbyists. And while we go to them with graphs and data, these other stakeholders go to them with huge piles of money. So of course, in the end, they end up not listening to the scientists. They go with the vested interests. There's this interesting term, the pollution paradox, which explains this partly. That with the pollution paradox, it says that the dirtier an industry, the more that industry has to spend on government lobbying to avoid getting regulated out of existence. So the dirtiest industries end up spending much more than the clean industries. Clean industries don't have to bribe the government. So in the end, governments end up governing for the benefits of the dirtiest industries. This is the pollution paradox. And it results in what we call state capture. The apparatus of state have been captured by vested interests. Information is not enough. Our second theory of change. So yeah, here's a headline just explicitly showing this just from a few months ago. This headline's not actually about climate change, but about the ecological emergency. But look at it, it says plain as day, UK overrules scientific advice by lifting ban on bee-harming pesticides. Can you imagine being one of these scientists? You spend years collecting all the data. You make that data available in reports and policy briefs for the government. The data are unequivocal. These pesticides should not be used. They are dangerous. They should be banned. And yet, in the end, the government says, well, the people that make the pesticide don't think they should be banned. That will limit their ability to draw profits. So we are going to listen to them, not you. We will allow these pesticides. Information alone is not enough because we are not competing on a level playing field. So what about our second theory of change? If we warn the public about what's happening, then the public will force our leaders to take the required action. Well, this doesn't work because the public is misinformed. The fossil fuel industries have spent decades investing huge amounts of money in very well-funded disinformation campaigns. First focusing on climate denialism, saying that it didn't exist, or it's not humans that caused it, or it's not a problem. Now they have moved on to delayism, talking about the reasons why we don't need to address it urgently. So as well as this disinformation, there is a general lack of information because the media don't talk about climate change. And when they do talk about extreme weather, they don't even mention that it's caused by climate change. So for example, this year in Western Europe, we had a heat wave that killed 20,000 people. 20,000 people were killed by this. But the newspaper coverage here in the UK was just photographs of children eating ice cream and playing in fountains. They present this as a good thing. And they don't even mention climate change. None of the media coverage during this heat wave even mentions that it was the result of climate change. So we just don't hear about it. There was a report that came out last year showing that in 2020, the word cake was mentioned 10 times more than climate change on TV in the UK. So the public is misinformed, the public is uninformed, the public does not demand action from its leaders. So we have this situation where it's just increasingly clear that science alone cannot trigger the transformative changes that we need at the speed that we need them, because it ignores the processes that most powerfully influence political and policy change. It ignores the existence of corporate lobbying, and it doesn't address those forces that are so heavily invested in maintaining the status quo. As much as we know that everything needs to change, many powerful people are very happy with the situation as it is now because it generates huge profits for them. And hello? And they don't want this change. So they're fighting against this change. So I think we need to rethink what we do as scientists. Many of us, we already know that just doing our science is not enough. And that's why we also campaign. We write letters to our MPs and we sign petitions, and sometimes we even go on a march. But these also are not sufficient. They have not led to the changes required. So I think, yeah, as scientists, we are evidence-based practitioners. We have to accept the evidence that what we are doing has not been enough so far. And we need to look at what the evidence is for alternatives that might have more impact. And the evidence of history suggests that non-violent civil disobedience or non-violent civil resistance may be a very powerful force in helping catalyze major social and policy changes. And many of the great social changes of the 20th century, be that the struggle for votes for women, the struggle for independence from the horrors of empire, the struggle for civil rights for people of color, the struggle for civil rights for LGBTQ plus people in the 1980s, and the fight for action on the AIDS epidemic. These were all won by non-violent civil disobedience. And this works in a number of ways. Primarily, it works by generating media attention and capturing the public imagination. It shines a light on issues that were not being talked about before. Nobody was really talking about the segregation of public transport in the USA, for example, until Rosa Parks refused to move from her bus. And then the media had to cover it, and then it put this issue on everybody's lips. And once the issue was in the public limelight, then everybody could see the injustice of it. Civil disobedience works partially through sacrifice. When people see others engaging in sacrifice, sacrificing their liberty, sacrificing their time, it makes them think, why would these people be willing to put themselves in such a situation if if what they were talking about wasn't important? So today we see non-violent civil disobedience has been on the rise for the last 4 years, and this time explicitly focused on the environment and on climate. And although the evidence is limited, it does seem that it's quite clear that these environmental movements have completely transformed the public conversation on climate change. They've changed the public conversation, they've changed the media, and they've changed governmental discourse. On the top left, we see polling data that show how public concern for climate change increases after Extinction Rebellion protests. This year, in January this year, climate change became the #1 concern for British people. above Brexit, above healthcare, above the economy, above all of it, above COVID even. And this has affected how the media talk about climate change. So on the top right, we have an example of a right-wing British newspaper, with talking about a green revolution on its front page. We had a climate debate before the last general election. We had a climate debate on the main news channel. And also we've seen declarations. So 3 days after the first big Extinction Rebellion protest in April 2019, the UK Parliament declared climate emergency. So these protests have been hugely successful in changing the conversation, but as we've seen, they haven't actually changed policies yet. So it's been a start, but not enough. When I came back from those first Extinction Rebellion protests in April 2019, I was really, so I spoke to a lot of people when I was there, and I met lots of lawyers and teachers and healthcare workers, but I didn't meet any scientists, and I was really surprised by this. So I came back and I drafted this commentary, which was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, saying that, you know, as scientists, we have tried to communicate this in all the acceptable ways, and none of it's working. So we should join these movements. And to my big surprise, this paper became a bit of a sensation online. There's this measure called altmetric, which measures the amount of online activity around different publications. And this paper went into the top 4,000 scientific publications ever measured by altmetric. Out of 20 million papers, this was in the top few thousand. So clearly, lots of scientists were you know, very interested to hear things like this being said. Of course, scientific activism is not a new thing. Even in the climate crisis, it's not a new thing. This man in the middle is perhaps the most famous climate scientist of all. This is James Hansen. It was James Hansen of NASA that first brought climate change to the public attention when he testified to US Congress in 1988. Well, he has been arrested several times blocking fossil fuel infrastructure because his knowledge compels him to take these actions. More recently, we've seen many scientists late in 2019, over 1,000 scientists signed this declaration of support for the mass civil disobedience of groups like Extinction Rebellion. They said, as scientists, we have an obligation that goes beyond just describing and understanding our world. We need to take an active part in helping to protect it. And again, this declaration noted that scientists have tried everything to ensure that global policy is based on the science, but none of it has worked. So as a member of Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion, I believe that scientists need to go further than just supporting these movements. We need to explicitly take part in them. And I think there are some key reasons for that. One is that we are some of the most trusted people in society. Society trusts scientists. And that means that we are very powerful messengers. And it also means that we can provide important legitimacy to these protest movements. Governments and the media often try to dismiss these protest movements as unimportant because these people are unemployed, they're just hippies, they're not like you, don't listen to them. So when we have groups like lawyers and doctors and scientists explicitly taking part in them, it increases their legitimacy, their credibility. Scientists, of course, often have access to platforms. We have a louder voice than ordinary members of the public. So I feel that gives us an obligation to use our voice on behalf of those that don't have a voice. Importantly, I think we need to act like it's an emergency. And personally, for me, this is why I take action with these groups. And this is why I'm prepared to risk arrest. It's because it's a form of communication. You know, for a long time, we have been telling the public that everything needs to change. But if you say everything needs to change, and then you just continue doing what you've always done, writing more grant proposals and writing more papers, then your behavior doesn't match your words. So why should people believe you? You know, if I was to tell you now that I can smell smoke coming from down the corridor and I think my house is on fire, but yet I was just to continue giving you this talk, of course you would not believe me that my house is on fire, because my behavior doesn't match my words. So for me, this is the most important reason of all why scientists must go beyond just doing our jobs. But lastly, also, I feel a sense of moral obligation. When I attend an Extinction Rebellion protest, for example, I know that all of these members of the public, they are there because they have listened to the science. They are scared by what we have told them. So I feel a sense of moral obligation to be there in support. Some people think that it's not the role of scientists to be advocates and activists. Our job is to be detached, neutral observers. We must provide information, but we must not comment on how that information should be used. And we hear this a lot. But when we examine this idea, it turns out that this is an idea from the Middle Ages. There's a historian at Cambridge that has shown this. In the Middle Ages, research was carried out by monks, and monks received their knowledge directly from the word of God. But to receive knowledge from God, they had to be detached, empty vessels, completely detached from the material world. So this is where this norm of scientific detachment comes from. It comes from the Middle Ages. But we are not in the Middle Ages anymore. We are in a planetary emergency. I've always found it weird, this idea that scientists should be detached, because some sciences aren't detached at all. Some sciences are explicitly value driven. Medical science is not a value neutral science. It exists specifically to improve human health. My field, I'm a conservation scientist. Conservation exists explicitly to achieve specific aims, the conservation of biodiversity. So whenever I make a statement as a conservationist, if I say, you know, we need to stop deforestation, or we need to catch fish sustainably, these are not just scientific statements, they are explicitly political statements. So you know, conservation scientists and medical scientists are inherently advocates. We are not detached. And for me, the shift from being an advocate to being an activist is not a change in neutrality, it is just a change in tactics. Other people worry that by becoming engaged in activism, it will reduce our credibility as scientists. Well, in fact, experimental psychology research shows this is probably not the case. In fact, in some places in Germany and the US, the public wants scientists to be even more engaged. They think that scientists are not doing enough. I'm sorry, I've been talking too long, so I'm slightly running out of time. I'm going to be quite quick here. I strongly feel that academics need to be doing more. However, we do not see many academics taking action. And I do not think it is just because they're worried about their reputations, they're worried about neutrality. I think it is largely because they are too busy. They don't have time. Academia is hugely competitive. To reach the top and become a well-known professor, you need to have focus and determination on just writing your grants and writing your papers. And I think, yeah, anything beyond that seems, not relevant because it doesn't directly contribute to your career. So to get over that, I think, and in this paper that I wrote with my colleagues, Aaron Cheery and Julia Steinberger and others, we argued that universities should take steps to support their staff in taking these actions. It should not be left to staff to do it on their own time, because we don't have time. It should be explicitly recognized as part of our work mandate. Universities should work to remove the barriers that stop academics taking part in advocacy and activism. This means recognizing that this kind of outreach activity can be part of our work and that we can be recognized for it when it comes to promotion decisions and things like that. And also that we should be trained to become more effective in these things, because we're not professionals in this. But whenever you look at the mission statement of a university, it will say, we want to make the world a better place. I have argued that in the emergency context, then simply looking at the institutional footprints and the teaching and the research is not enough. So if universities want to make the world a better place, they have to support their staff in doing more. They also need to fight to protect the freedom of their staff, to push back against threats on academic freedom, because we are seeing protests being criminalized around the world. Sorry, I haven't left very much time, but I just want to speak very, very briefly about what academics can do within these movements. Because when we see protests on the TV news and we see people being arrested, it's very easy to think that the only task is to be arrested. But not everybody in the Air Force is a pilot, and not everybody in Extinction Rebellion is getting arrested. Instead, 90% of them are involved in other roles, doing writing, doing planning, making arts, doing media work, writing press releases, doing social media, mobilization, fundraising. All of these are skills that academics have in abundance, that these movements can use, and they need support of people with these skills. So of course, there's much more that you can do than just be arrested. One thing that I have done a lot also, which I think is super important, is writing expert witness statements to support activists in court. If activists don't have expert witness statements from scientists explaining the science, then that means the judges and the juries in these trials are not hearing about the science. So this is really important. There are lots and lots of things we can do. There are also lots of ways to engage in creative forms of civil disobedience that don't have to risk any arrest at all. And there are there's this wonderful document by Gene Sharp called 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action. I just want to show you this picture on the top. This is a group of friends of mine called the Dirty Scrubbers. They are protesting outside Barclays Bank, the biggest fossil fuel funder in Europe. You can get arrested for breaking the windows of Barclays Bank, but you cannot get arrested for cleaning the windows of Barclays Bank. So, you know, much environmental protest is, in fact, it's a form of performance art. And we can be very creative with the ways in which we carry out protests. If I have just 1 minute, just to give you a little case study of an organization I take action with called Scientist Rebellion, which exists really to help mobilize other scientists. It was only formed in 2020, but at COP26, we carried out the first ever mass arrest of scientists over climate. And we blocked a bridge for 5 hours, and 21 of us were arrested, and it became it was very high profile. It was covered in the journal Nature, it was covered in global media, because it is such an unusual thing for scientists to get arrested in this way. This year in April, we had over 1,000 scientists taking part in 28 countries. It was, this has really become a very global movement in just a short period of time. So if any of you are interested in the work of Scientist Rebellion, you can find us everywhere online. And that's it, really. So I look forward to hearing your questions. I know I covered a lot, and my apologies, my brain's not really working today, so it wasn't as smooth as I would have liked. And I know all of us are, we're professionals, and we are dedicated professionals, and we have important jobs, and we are doing important work. However, I really think that even everything we are doing is not enough. But as scientists, we do have a particular power because of the respect that society affords us. And I would just encourage all of us to recognize that, and to do as much as we can to try and catalyze climate action in other ways beyond the more traditional ways that we do in our jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for the passionate talk. It was really great. So people that want to ask questions can either raise their hand or type it in the chat. We have another 10-15 minutes, so we have time for questions. I'll maybe start with one, Charlie. I always have the feeling that it's quite easy in the scientific world to convince like 10% of the scientists, but then the others are either too occupied or don't react. So still keeping in our bubble. Do you have any advice to reach the other 90%?
I wish I knew. I've been really struggling with this, to be honest. I think there's a number of reasons for it. So I guess the most important thing is to understand what the barriers are. And so we're seeing quite a lot. There are a number of social scientists working on this now, but I think the research is in its infancy and we don't really know. I'd hesitate to say, but as a general point, I think we should try and seek to understand why people aren't, and that means listening rather than just preaching. Rather than saying you should be doing this, we need to ask why aren't you? And I think I have several theories. One is, I think, just this idea that academia is, especially the neoliberalized academia now, is incredibly competitive. It's very, very difficult for young researchers to get a permanent position. And with this competitiveness means that we simply don't have time. Most academics I know are already working 1.5 times the allocation of a full-time job. And they don't have a moment spare. So of course, these extra additional things always fall to the bottom of the list. You have to do the things you are paid for. Of course, I talked also about our professional ambition. And of course, we all want to do fantastic research. We all want to, become influential professors one day. But I think we need to recognize that, our personal ambition, and this applies beyond just academia, but and it applies to all sectors and everybody. We all have our hopes and dreams for the future. We all want to have a nice, quiet retirement where we have, earned lots of money, we've become successful, and we can just retire to a nice life. Well, none of these futures that we imagine for ourselves will exist if we don't change everything now. So perhaps we need to, in talking to colleagues and things, we need to just gently and in a non-judgmental way help remind people of these things. But also, as I said, we need to change the incentive structures, because at the moment there's no, there are lots of disincentives. There are from our employers, there are lots of reasons not to engage with these movements, but there are few reasons to do it. So we need to get higher education institutions to provide some incentives, or at least to reduce the disincentives. And that's what their paper was about.
Yeah, no, I agree, but it was good to hear that. I think but that means we need to change it on like the organizational level. There's a question from Uli Brandt, who is a political scientist, and he asked, and he considers himself activist scholar. Isn't there a danger that we undermine public credibility with actions? So if you take civil disobedience, and isn't there, and the theory of change is civil disobedience, is this not too narrow? Is this second question? Yeah.
Thank you. These are really important questions, and your field is such an important one in this crisis. It's for so long we have talked about addressing climate change in technical terms, whereas ultimately it's not a technical problem. It's a problem of power and influence. So that's what we need to focus on. And of course, political science has a lot to say on this. As the first part of your question, is there a risk of diminishing scientific credibility? Yes. I'd say there is an equal risk of diminishing scientific credibility from inaction. What will society say when it finds out that scientists knew all this time, scientists knew what would happen, and yet they thought it was enough to just write papers? This is what a huge dereliction of duty. And I think there's always risks with whatever we do, but I think inaction is a much bigger risk than action. Of course, being aware of the risks is the first necessary step to taking steps to mitigate them and reduce the possibility of it. Personally, I find that by taking action has enhanced my credibility as a scientist, as a member of staff, as a former member of staff at a university, and as a teacher. My credibility was enhanced because my actions met my words. And like I say, I'm a conservation scientist. Conservation science is not politically neutral. So stepping up and saying things doesn't change that at all.
Charlie, may I just one? My point is not to write papers and not to write papers and to perform civil disobedience, but there are so many other forms to be a public intellectual, to intervene publicly, etc., etc. It's not the dichotomy to go to the street or to write papers, but there is so much in between, and we should consider this.
Thank you. Yes. I agree with that, and my theory of change was narrowly framed. So my theory of change is not explicitly that that civil disobedience is the only thing that's required. What I think is required is we need to catalyze a critical mass of people, the public. I think the only way we're going to get out of this is through reaching social tipping points. So the question then is, how, as scientists, do we catalyze and contribute towards reaching social tipping points? I think, and you mentioned some ways to do that. I think civil disobedience is important because it breaks through the silence. By doing something outrageous or disruptive, it breaks through. It means the media cover it, and it gets the issue talked about. Once the issue is talked about, then I think there are other ways to keep the issue talked about and to persuade people of the necessity of change, to persuade people to get involved, and all of those things are important. But I think the civil disobedience is a key element of that, because it starts the broader discussion. As I say, it brings the discussion from the shadows out into the limelight, and it stretches the boundaries of the discussion. There's this concept of the Overton window, which is, the acceptable spectrum of political thought or political discussion. Activism immediately stretches the Overton window, and it creates space. Now, it's not the activists that will actually be implementing change. We need other institutions to do that, but activism helps create the space in which these other things can take place. So if there are people that want to do something, don't want to support activism, that's fine, that's absolutely fine, but then move into the space that has been created by the activists and do something else within that space. But yes, thank you for pointing that out. Certainly, activism is not the only thing that is required. It was just, for time constraints, I just simplified my message.
All right, I think we'll manage maybe 3 questions, maybe one from Katharina Eckhart, who is actually going to be our next speaker. So Katharina, please unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you very much. I certainly want to underline the importance of science and also civil disobedience, as long as it's not destroying artworks. But I'm missing a third pillar in this discussion. This is about our personal contribution, about what we can change in our organizations, and what every single one of us may seem so little contribute in daily decisions to the change.
Yes, this is absolutely important, and thanks for pointing that out. I think partially I don't focus on that because this is what we mainly hear about whenever there is something in popular media or magazines about what we can do about climate change. It's always just focused on our personal carbon footprints. So a lot is known about that already. But it's also the case that this work is limited in its impact. It's limited in scope. But whether we're addressing our impacts as individuals or as institutions, it's limited in scope. And so as a result of that, lots of people have moved away from that. They explicitly choose not to focus on personal responsibilities because they say this is too small. They say also this lets the real culprits off the hook. It's not my fault that my emissions are quite high. All I'm doing is existing in an industrial society. And you can't blame me for existing. It's the fault of those that ensure that we are locked into a fossil fuel dependent industrial society. And I used to think
that's one of the essential problems of this discussion, and I also believe that this attitude stems from that this discussion is always led about emergencies, about catastrophes, and this leads to total avoidance. So I think we have to move to showing solutions. How can we solve this and away from this dystopic scenery.
I do agree about that. I do agree that we need to shift our communications onto what people can do. So I think, yeah, so that's another way in which activism is just a starting point. Activism has served to make people worried, and now most of the population in our societies, they do know about climate change and they are worried, but they are not doing anything because they don't know what to do. And so providing them with the roadmap as to what they could do is really important. And this is why, and this is what I was going to say, this is why individual action is important, because our individual decisions aren't made in isolation. They actually influence other people. There's a very strong phenomenon of social contagion. When we do things, other people see them. When a museum like yours or a laboratory like yours, Jerome, takes actions, that is communicated to others, and other museums want to do it as well. Other laboratories want to do it as well. So this is where the real importance of individual or institutional change comes from. It's an example of leadership that spurs others to do it as well.
Okay, we have one more question, Charlie. It's from Julia, who asked, climate emergency is a very complex problem, so not easy to communicate. How can you communicate with the public? And before you answer, there's a lot of comments, and ones are from Helga Krom-Komp from the BOKU, which is another university in Vienna, she has been very active in the field, raising sustainability and climate change at universities in Austria. And it was great that she was in the audience, but she just left. And she also supported, but she says like she's getting, or her career is more or less ending. And the question is, what should she do? But she's not doing civil disobedience yet. But the question posed itself if she should do it. But maybe the question from Julia was the communication. How do you deal with the complex aspect of climate change?
Of course, it is hugely complex. I think we just need to bear in mind some general key principles, and I can't talk about this in detail now, but of course, adapt your message to your audience, understand what it is that they care about, and adapt your message to them. Listen to them, understand where they're coming from. And I think perhaps most importantly, certainly when we're talking about institutions, it's lovely to see Cameron Brick in this call. Thanks very much for your message, Cameron. I'm a big fan of yours as well. I think we need to make the business case for climate action, and most of the time that doesn't even involve talking about climate change. The world is embarking on a big transition. It's a technological transition partly, and every institution, every university, and every lab has to embark on this transition. If it doesn't, it will get left behind. And there are big advantages in being a first mover in this transition. So, if I go to speak to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Kent and tell her about, to encourage her to focus on sustainability, she might care about climate change, but it is not her job to care about climate change. So I won't even mention that. I will simply talk to her about, I will show her the data that shows that students want to go to sustainable universities, because that is what her job is about. So I'll just focus on that. So just adapt your message to your audience is, I think, the key thing. And you don't have to say everything about climate change. It's too big and too complex.